Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
What is hoodoo? Are there modern shamans practicing it in 21st century America? Do their healing techniques actually work?
Greetings and welcome to the 579th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I am Ben, and those alternative questions came from my co-host and partner in the paranormal, my dad. And this evening we bring you an eminent guest on a subject we never really talk about that much. And we welcome your calls this evening. The numbers are 800-449-1240. That's from anywhere in the U.S. or Canada, or 401-766-1240. That is locally. Also, we will monitor Paul at BehindTheParanormal.com for emails as well. So if you feel like not talking to us with your voice, you can talk to us by typing to us. So it is up to you, Dad.
Okay. Dr. Paul J. Leslie is an author and psychotherapist in Aiken, South Carolina. He specializes in creative, resource-directed approaches to working with individuals and families. His books focus on the areas of psychotherapy, healing, shamanism, and personal development. And the books include Potential, Not Pathology, Helping Your Clients Transform Using Ericksonian Psychotherapy, Get Out of Your Seat, An Average Passenger's Guide to Overcoming Airline Terror, and the subject of our discussion this evening, Low Country Shamanism, an exploration of the magical and healing practices of the coastal Carolinas and Georgia. Currently, Dr. Leslie is the coordinator of the Behavioral Sciences program at Aiken Technical College in South Carolina. His website, www.drpaulleslie.com.
So, Dr. Paul Leslie, welcome to Behind the Paranormal.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you gentlemen today.
Oh, it's really nice to have you. So let's start from the bare basics here. So are there really shamans practicing in the American Southeast?
American Southeast, I would say there are definitely individuals who are practicing forms of healing and spiritual development that we call in the Low Country, which is the coastal Carolinas and coastal Georgia, as root doctors. And, yes, I would say that they fit the definition of shaman.
Okay, so what kind of practices are we talking about here?
Well, everything from medicinal healing, things like herbology, to spiritual healing, which is the use of rituals, sometimes these sacred dances, sometimes doing, spells, different kind of tasks that they give their, I guess we'll call them clients, in order to help them heal.
We're still working on that. The head engineer is currently out of town.
Well, all right, let's... It's funny because you're bringing back memories in a way. Not that I've ever been a shaman in the Carolinas, but Ben's maternal grandfather is from an old South Carolina family. And there was an uncle of my wife's who sort of took a shine to this Yankee here, and he gave me a wonderful book on South Carolina legends and folklore. And that's what really drew us to you when you wrote to us about the show, was a very, very interesting sort of subject for us personally, especially. So what is the origin of the tradition that these people use?
Well, the origin is actually West Central Africa. Many, many years ago, as we all know, when the slave trade came in and decimated good chunks of Africa, West Central Africa, particularly the Kingdom of Congo, was one of the most powerful kingdoms in Central Africa. And they had their own kind of unique spiritual view about the world. They held that the worldview that they were a part of nature rather than separate from it. They viewed that this tradition, which hoodoo comes from, as a way to interact with the spirit world to obtain powers such as healing and protection. And when it came to the New World, particularly the coastal Carolinas and Georgia, a lot of the religious aspects had to disappear because the slaves were kind of forced into this Protestant religious worldview by their masters, and so they had to drop a lot of the religious components. However, the magical and healing parts they kind of held on to. So I look at hoodoo or conjure, and we call it in the Low Country sometimes root work, as a method of magic, but a medium also which the slaves historically used to endure oppression and gain protection and create a sense of hope.
Well, I remember my uncle-in-law telling me one time that they were, and he would bring me to his cabal, which was a bunch of old retired guys, gather at a coffee shop near Charleston. We would shoot the breeze because they were all fellows who, were kind of interested in the paranormal. And they said that there were plenty of shamans of European descent who also were known to be healers. And I heard the term root work or that sort of thing. And have you run into? Is it all of the African tradition, or is there some shamanism of the European tradition as well, or do they mix?
Well, in some levels they mix. Now, I also want to point out that before, we look at, hoodoo as strictly African in origin, there were also similar practices in colonial, antebellum America. They had a group of people who were known as witch masters, and these were employed by white people in colonial era to protect them from witches and illnesses caused by curses. And so they were actually employed in the same manner as the stereotypical African witch doctor, to add protection. So it was real interesting to me how reading a lot of the looking down on the African elements of the slave owners and people like that, but there were similar practices found, within their culture. But for hoodoo, I would say it was the majority African in nature, with elements from the colonial Europeans, as well as some from, some people conjectured some Native American influence.
Okay. It's funny, Ben and I are direct descendants of two people who were hanged for witchcraft in the 1740s in Connecticut. Oh, well. But
well, the last witch trial was actually in Lancaster, South Carolina.
That's where my wife's family's from.
Ooh, synchronicity.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we'll have to have a talk with Mom about that. Yes, unfortunately, Uncle Ned has gone to that great coffee shop in the sky, so I have to wait a while to talk to him. But in any case, it's an interesting tradition. Doctor, how is shamanism in South Carolina and Georgia different from shamanism in other places, say New Orleans or New England or wherever?
Right. Well, the things I've tried to concentrate on is the consistent similarity, because I found that there's not, at the conceptual level, there's not a lot of difference between most legitimate forms of shamanism. I based a lot on Eliade's work way back when, where he kind of wrote the book on what constitutes a shaman. That shaman spirits interact with spirits day to day, and they communicate with the spirit world, and they can be helpful to ward off evil. They can treat spiritual sickness. They can go into trance. All these kind of fortune-telling, divination stuff. So in practices, in the magic, not a lot. Now, you mentioned like New Orleans, voodoo with a V. I've been talking about voodoo with an H, but voodoo with a V is also a religion. They were able to hold on to some of the religious elements of the African tradition because, in Haiti and the Caribbean and then into Louisiana, that was primarily years and years back controlled by the French, who were Catholic. So the slaves were able to project a lot of their African deities onto different Catholic saints, angels, those kind of things, whereas in the southeast, particularly the coastal areas, we have Baptists, and Baptists don't have saints and all these deities. We have Jesus and God, the Father, and that's it. So, the big difference there would be voodoo is more of, has the magic and all, but it also has the religion, whereas hoodoo is a more pragmatic oral tradition of magic and healing. Okay.
Where would Santeria fit into all this? And for anyone who doesn't know, Santeria is a sort of, it always struck me as a sort of composite religion made up of Christian elements or at least Roman Catholic elements and, different aspects of what we've been talking about here. If I'm right about that, is that separate from this, or does that fit in with any of these traditions, or what?
Well, it certainly fits in, has differences, but again, primarily an African component, but then really blended with Catholicism, along with a lot of Caribbean beliefs that have kind of gotten in there. And then a lot of times we think it's coming from Cuba, some of the beliefs they had, but all of that originated out in the Caribbean, where the French were in control until, like in Haiti, they were in control till they were overrun and run out, and so they took a lot of their slaves with them, carrying a lot of those voodoo-related beliefs into other areas of the United States or of the Caribbean.
Okay. I've had some experience with shamans, albeit in Australia and Quebec, respectively, and the one in Australia particularly said whether it be healings or curses, they're really not going. And I was told I was very fortunate, because they usually don't talk to outsiders, but this was an odd circumstance. So they usually don't work unless you believe in them. So I said a lot of people who have other faiths, maybe won't be affected by these things. So the question is, have you found that the healings work, or sometimes, or any curses? Because I know there's some darkness with some of this stuff, not always. But what's your experience with whether or not what the shamans do for people or to people work?
Well, let me just real quick put out, since we're talking about these acts, I think it was Michael Bell in 1980 wrote out.
Michael Bell? He's a friend of mine. He's the Rhode Island State historian, if it's the same person.
Oh,
not historian, a folklorist.
Oh, well, it may be. He talked about different acts that voodoo people do, and he put them into, I think, 5 categories, and I'm just kind of pulling these off the top of my head, so forgive me if I get them a little twisted. But
no, not at all.
One would be a punitive act, so it's punishment. So doing punishment. I think one was the cause of a problem, curative acts, protection, and good fortune. Now, all of those, to answer your question, all of those type of spells, divination, all those things, yes, there has to be a strong component of belief involved, and not just belief on the person who's receiving, but I was told time and time again by root doctors who practice, they have to believe it. They have to have that intention, because if the person prescribing the act, the ritual, all that does not have the faith in it, then they feel that it will be worthless.
Okay. That corresponds with what I heard. In your experience, have you dealt with people who have been or said they've been healed by a shaman, and if so, have these healings lasted?
Well, I haven't. I'm sure there are folks out there. I've just kind of briefly talked to a couple of them about who were recipients of healing, and they, claim that they did get much help from it. But most of the people who are talked to tend to focus on the punitive aspects. And I think that may be human nature. We're always going to look at the bad things rather than the good things. But it's funny, the first I ever heard about root doctors, and by the way, the root doctors essentially came from this idea that, when they were healing herbally, they would use a lot of roots and flowers, and then the term root became used as a talisman that would embody and express a magical spell. So when they were doing all these roots, we were talking about therapy setting. We were doing some supervision with some other therapists, and one kept talking about how she had a client who was suffering some severe anxiety because somebody had, quote, put the root on him. And I didn't know what the heck they were talking about. And so she finally told me, it's kind of like a type of, witchcraft. And so I kind of figured that the only way, if his belief was so strong, he would have to find somebody to even just to pretend that the root had been lifted, because it's just so intense. And so all we could do really is just direct him, you go find somebody who can take it off, because no amount of talk therapy is going to convince you that you're going to be fine. So this has quite a good bit of power, even if it's in just the mind of the person being affected.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose that could be true for any aspect of medicine or practice. Or, if you don't believe it, it's not going to have any effect.
What's like the placebo effect?
That sort of thing, yeah. I mean, to a certain extent. Even medication, so I've read, to a certain extent, depending on the situation. In any case,
I had read that placebos outperform most medicines, by the way.
Indeed, so have I. It's true.
Irony.
What are these shamans like as people? Or is there any one description you can use for all of them or most of them?
Well, I hate to generalize.
Yes, indeed.
Because they're just so different. I mean, people... Now, let me just differentiate. There are people who practice, and there are people who assume the mantle of the hoodoo doctor or the root doctor. So the actual doctors, the spiritual guides, because I believe these people basically took the missing element of the African priest in, when they came to the New World. In today's world, they take the world of the spiritual guides. Sometimes people go to them for psychic reading, sometimes for, these kind of energetic related healings. Most of them I have met are fairly humble people, and which kind of surprised me. And I guess my stereotypical prejudice was I was expecting to find some more, I hate to use this term, but devious personalities. But most all of the people most all of them I met were actually good, nice folks who were just wanting to help others.
Okay. Well, there we are, I suppose. I have heard, and you can tell me whether you've heard the same thing, that there is the occasional doctor with an MD who has been through medical school, a standard doctor, who will embrace at times some or all of the practices of shaman. Not necessarily in this country so much, but I've heard, there are different parts of the world where that may be true. Have you run into that in any number, or is it true? Or
well, I personally have not read too much interaction in my area. There have been a lot of research here and there about folk beliefs, and I do remember reading and actually talked to a gentleman at a convention I attended where I presented on this topic, and he was telling me that in upstate South Carolina years ago, late 70s maybe, that they brought in with all the different folk healers a root doctor to kind of learn how I can't remember, it could be a she, but they're interchangeable in a lot of ways here, but what their techniques were and that kind of thing, because they wanted to kind of have a balanced view of what, members of the population believed in, and hopefully that could be used to help facilitate, an understanding of the cross-cultural implications of this diagnostic and treatment.
So how does one actually become a shaman? Because I know in this society it's very easy to read like a how-to guide or whatever to do whatever. I'm pretty sure you don't just sit down and read a bunch of books and then say, all right, well, I guess I'm a shaman now. So what's the real training? What's the preparation by these people?
Well, this is an excellent question, because it does seem to be a lot of things. If you go on the internet and put shaman training, a lot of folks are claiming to be shaman, and if you go to their $3,000 2-week course or whatever, you could be a shaman too. But I have a colleague who traveled the world and studied with all different shaman, including the Kalahari, which is one of the oldest living traditions. Almost
the Bushman, yeah.
And he has some very definite answers about shamanism, and all of it is that you have to go through an ordeal. There's an ordeal. There's not a seminar admission. It is, it either happens spontaneously or you have to go through a lot of struggle. Now, in my area of the Low Country, I found some similarities between other shaman cultures, like in Siberia, the Buryat, which is in southern Siberia. If lightning strikes at a certain time when a baby is being born, they say, well, that baby is destined to be a shaman. I found that to be true with a lot of the research I've done. The Yurok in northern Siberia said if the baby is born with the caul covering their face, then that is a sign of a shaman. And that is very much one of the signs of a shaman. So it's a gift given from the spirit world rather than something you pay for.
It seems almost cultural, too. Yeah. That's just pretty much what I've gathered from most of our conversation so far.
There do seem to be similarities.
Yeah, I mean, there's similarities.
Commonality.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's sort of like a weird, what's the word, unconscious cultural decision.
Yeah, Jung would call it, they're tapped into that collective unconscious, ideal, and I can see that.
Well, I've known several shaman, but the two I knew best were, as I say, in Australia and Quebec, respectively, in two opposite ends of the planet. And they stressed two things to me. They were both educated people, in our sense of the term, as well as being shaman. One is that what you see is not necessarily what you get. In other words, the terms they often use are symbolic. They had a real sense of what we might call the quantum multiverse, or, depending upon the quantum hologram, that kind of thing. And the one in Australia said, yeah, and I was just starting to think about this in the late 70s, and I was in Australia on the line of duty, and he said, you're on the right track. So that's what we really do. We talk about the spirits and everything else, and, that's the idea. But we go from different worlds to other worlds and bring back what people need. That kind of, and we make the worlds one. I mean, the guy's talking about collapse of the wave function, for heaven's sake.
Right.
Like the physicist would. It was amazing. And the one in Quebec, same thing. He was telling me about somebody who went into another world and brought back somebody who died here and hadn't died there, and here he was standing in front of everybody again. And that sort of stuff. So, but this leads in, and I want to get into this after the break, so we have a break in about 4 minutes. But start getting into, what is really going on here. Do they understand it? Is it always what it appears to be in the sense of what anybody would call good or bad? And someone of a Christian bent might say, or Jewish, or really any standard religion, or even Muslims might call, angelic versus demonic. I mean, what's really happening here? Because I attended a voodoo ceremony in Haiti in 1984, and I was told it was a great honor. But the priest took a real shine to me for some reason, which he usually didn't do with outsiders, and I was invited to this, and it was one of the scariest things I'd ever seen in my life. And it looked awfully familiar to me from working with poltergeist cases and exorcisms and stuff like that. And I said, whoa, this is like the same kind of critters. So anyway, but before we get to that, and before we get to our break, I just I had one question on my list here that I wanted to ask you, Doctor, and that's about rural versus urban shamanism, and that's because of my number 2 point that these two guys told me, which was that the kind of shamanism you practice, or even the kind of religion and the things you believe, really springs from the land, and they really emphasized a connection between the shaman and the people and the land. And I harked back almost to the Arthurian legend from Europe, wherein the monarch is identified with the land. And even when we have a couple of titled relatives in England, and one is an earl, and he is known as Lord Devon, because that's the county. The family was, 600 years they off and on they held that title, but it's almost like he's equated with the county of Devon. And I saw that in the shamanic world as well. I mean, so what is the connection between the land and the shaman in the tradition of the southeast that we've been discussing this evening? I know it's a weird question, but
Yeah, and I'll try to make it quick because I know we're getting close to a break.
Yeah, well, it's not a hard break.
Yeah, okay. The idea of the land of nature, that harkens back to Africa in that everything had a spirit in it. I mean, for example, in Africa, in particular West Central Africa, you find something called Bakulu, which were long dead ancestors. They would often view the ancestors inhabiting the ethereal plane, but also in the land. And then they would actually have something called the Sindi, which are the spirits in the land, almost kind of like, what we would call animism. And then there's Menkisi, who are sometimes spirits found in amulets and charms. And all of these are this interface, this almost pantheistic, if you will, view of nature. So even though obviously the slaves couldn't own their own land as wild lords and people who would control the land, they were always connected to nature at a much deeper level than their white owners.
Mm.
So they saw things a little differently and how they interact.
Yeah, sometimes very differently, especially today, I would think. Well, very good. Well, let's take our break. You're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 and ONWorldwide.com in New England's beautiful and finally thawing out Blackstone River Valley. We'll be right back with our fascinating guest, Dr. Paul Leslie. Stick with us.
Hi, I'm Russ Gorman. It was written in the stars, and what was written in the stars will be. Your astrological chart is based on the positions the planets are in on the day you were born, influencing your destiny, past, present, and future. I've had decades of experience doing charts with a large celebrity clientele and others all over the world. The stars are a beacon lighting your future. Your chart provides the answers to questions on health, money, relationships, all your most important concerns. The in-depth guidance that you need is here for you. If there's a windfall in your chart, I'll find it. Call me at 401-333-4048 to order your chart or update, revealing the exciting changes coming up. Let me tell you how to get the most out of your future and keep you moving forward. I'm available for speaking engagements, for clubs and groups, and for private parties. Call me at 401-333-4048. Benefit through my years of experience.
And welcome back. And before we get back to our conversation, I wanted to remind you of a few of the charities Ben and I have adopted. We're going to have a new one probably coming up next week, but I want to get all the details first. Certainly, USACares.org, doing wonderful things financially for the heroes who have fought in the war against terror in the last, since 9/11. Also locally here in northern Rhode Island, and all of Rhode Island actually, BuildersHelpingHeroes.org, a great organization that is a subsidiary of the Rhode Island Builders Association, nonprofit group, and they actually built a house in Burrillville, Rhode Island, in our local listening area here in 2013. Did a wonderful job, and absolutely free of charge to the hero who had for a Marine who had lost both his legs in Afghanistan, and it was a very happy ending to that story, as much as it could be. And also, on the civilian level, certainly a youth mentoring connection in Los Angeles. Tony Larray out there doing a fantastic job using ancient wisdom of the best sort that I suppose that we're even talking about this evening to help at-risk youth. And Tony's doing a great job out there, and I understand he's expanding into New Orleans soon, also involved in Peru and other areas where they're going to adopt his techniques to help at-risk youth. Youthmentoring.org, a terrific job out there that Tony is doing. So let's try and support these charities. Also, Canadian Veterans Advocacy for our cousins to the north who have been with us in Afghanistan all along and doing great things for UN peacekeeping, and a lot of very brave veterans there in Canada have been wounded as well. So let's check out CanadianVeteransAdvocacy.org. Okay, let's get back to our great conversation with Dr. Paul Leslie. And I'll give you our numbers again. I always forget to do that. I only do it once, and nobody says that they remember them. So it's 800-449-1240 from anywhere in the U.S. or Canada, and locally 401-766-1240 here in the northern Rhode Island, Boston, Providence area. Give us a call on that line as well. So, Dr. Leslie, let's get into some of the depth here about what is actually happening. Let's start, I suppose, with my experience, which has not been good with a lot of this. Not necessarily shamanism as such, but with people who have been involved in some negative aspects of it. Have you ever run into someone who has come to you, say, as a patient, or has come to someone else for psychological help in any way, who has been, affected negatively by what was supposed to have been a healing or even a curse or something of this kind? Has that crossed your path at all?
Me personally, no. And the only other time was the one I had mentioned right before the break about hearing someone else's case. I have only had one other instance of anything of a paranormal issue where a woman who was having anxiety she traced it back to 8 years old, seeing a ghost and being brought up in a haunted house, and so that made her very anxious, and she traced it back to that. But now I do hear, not directly with me as clients, but I have heard of people who they feel like something has happened to them, and they will seek out the hoodoo root doctor to kind of offset a curse by someone else. But as far as people coming to therapy, number one, I have found, and it's so funny to me, I have found that they will go to the root doctor, they'll go to the psychic, they'll go to their priest, they'll go to their friend, they'll go to their doctor, and then when all that fails, then they'll come to the therapist. You know? So it's the whole stigma about therapy, but I could do probably a couple hours on that.
Sure. No, certainly understand. No, I mean, I've seen that thing happen, sort of thing happen again and again. Yeah, I worked in as a student and as a seminary student and as a graduate student in psychology. I worked in a couple of psychiatric wards back when there were more inpatients than there are today. And no, it's very true. It was often the last resort, and perhaps it should have been the first or one of the first anyway. Let's get back to the actual practices themselves. What comparisons would you make between the practices we've discussed, which essentially came from somewhere else, and the practices of, say, the Native Americans or Aboriginal practices in America?
I would not be 100% qualified to talk about the Native American practices, so I want to make that disclaimer before I go ahead and talk about the Native Americans.
Oh, certainly, yeah, okay.
Yeah. But what I found, in my research and discussions with people, is, and I won't limit this just to Native Americans and shamans as a whole. They felt that in the Low Country, a lot of the root doctors, they are the interface between the spirit world and the physical world, much the way that the medicine man, medicine woman, they feel that same void. They communicate with spirits. Since the spirits interact in the day-to-day affairs of people, they need a mediator. And the root doctor fills the role much the way the medicine man fills the role in a lot of the Native American tribes. The idea that if we have sickness, your physical sickness may be really spiritual sickness. Now, I found this in a lot of reading about Native American healing, apart from, we occasionally get a cold or a flu, but other than that, a lot of other deep sicknesses they think are spiritual sickness. It's just showing up in physical form, as does the root doctor. They say, well, if you've got, whatever serious health issue, it's because you have a spiritual sickness that needs to be fixed. And, trying to heal on the physical plane is not the way to heal. So the root doctor has to either journey psychically, if you will, or create a series of rituals and healings in order to enact change on the spiritual plane, because the physical is affected by the spiritual.
Sure. Isn't there now, for at least maybe 20, 25 years, a certain respect now by mainstream medicine, including mainstream psychology and psychiatry, a certain respect for something like that point of view? I mean, to a point. In other words, there seems to be an understanding, which was beginning when I was involved in it, that one's psychological state / spiritual state, if you want to use, depending on what term you want to use, can affect one's physical state, and that then transpersonal psychology gets into that too.
Right.
What are you finding as far as that's concerned? Is that point of view being more accepted, regardless of the terms you use? That there's more to a person than physical well-being.
Yeah, that's slowly changing. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective.
Yeah.
With the inclusion of more and more pharmaceutical intervention, with diagnostic criterias and left brain, ways of doing medicine and therapy, we've actually, in a lot of ways, even though we've gone more accepting, we have actually shifted to more of a medical model. So if you have depression, then it is really due to serotonin issues. If you have anxiety where you don't have enough acetylcholine, you've got too much norepinephrine, and we're trying to get away because I'll just take the pill and all will be well. But we know that there's more to dimensions, even if we don't get into the spiritual plane, the emotional. What has happened to you and is down in your unconscious may indeed be running your nervous system, and that's why you're so nervous, and then you have to resolve that old stuff. But, so we're kind of bipolar, if you will. I hate to use that term, but one part of us in the psychotherapy field is we're more open to these kind of things, but the other is, no, it needs to be evidence-based, peer-reviewed. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Kind of more of a materialistic, same kind of stuff that science is grappling with as well. So
there's still a struggle, certainly, between the old materialist paradigm, which is, from our point of view, has pretty much been blown out of the water by many philosophical and developments in philosophy and physics, certainly, and the point of view that is more holistic, that recognizes other aspects to the human being.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Ben had a question.
Well, I can understand psychological illnesses like depression and all those things, but to play devil's advocate here, what about physical ailments, like serious physical ailments? Like, I'm not sure about here in the Western world, but I know in West Africa, if a child has polio, that means the mother was cursed, so then the child is then abandoned. I know there's nothing that serious here. But
you never know. Who knows?
Yeah, well, not that I know of, at least. But I'm not sure about here in the Western world. But what about serious illnesses like that, where medicine is indeed required?
Well, the one thing I have found is that in the Low Country area, it's almost like now you will go to the doctor, but if the doctor isn't effective, then you'll seek out the supernatural. But at the same time, if we're not adequately dealing with our emotions, the more we're learning about the brain, that stuff comes back. I'll give you a quick example. I had a client who had suffered for 10 years with severe fibromyalgia, and to the point where she was, just couldn't do her job. She was debating on having to get on disability. Everything hurt, constant pain, constant trips to the doctor. A doctor says one of the more severe cases of fibromyalgia he had seen. Well, in the midst of our therapy and utilizing, I also do clinical hypnotherapy, we regressed back to when she was 3 years old. And when she was 3 years old, she had gotten abducted by someone away from her parents, some woman she didn't know who was kind of mentally off. And for a couple of hours, she didn't think she'd ever see her parents again. And that created an emotional powder keg that when she went back to her parents, it never quite healed. So the nervous system was still operating, seeing the world through this fear of I could always be lost, I'm in danger, which just you create that level of stress, it starts to cause problems with your immune system. So fibromyalgia affects that tension from anxiety, affects the fibrous muscles in the body. Once she was able to get all the emotion out, heal that part, within a couple of weeks, her fibromyalgia had cut by 50%. So we're not even paying attention, as I think we could, to the emotional plane, let alone the spiritual, if such an area even exists.
Yeah. Doc, we're burning up the hour very quickly here. I want to give you a chance. Let's do it right now before we lose the time. Give you a chance to talk about your books, your website, what you're working on, and where people can find out more about you.
Easiest place is my website, drpaulleslie.com. My books are available on Amazon. I have, as you mentioned at the top of the hour, I have books on therapy, books on personal development, and certainly low country shamanism, which we're talking about this hour. And, check there for my blog. My, most of my writings are actually more about therapy, but, some changes, my new, kind of odd interest. You don't know where that's going to take me.
Well, I may read the one on flying. I love flying. It's airplanes I can't stand, so maybe I'll read your book on that. But we assure everyone, we checked out Dr. Leslie very thoroughly. He really is a doctor. He really has a real degree. He's a good writer, and so we encourage you to check him out. You wouldn't believe the people who want to be on the show who have mail-order degrees, and they're really not. You have to be careful of that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's so easy to just write into like a website and be like, I'd like a doctorate, please.
Well, exactly. Yeah, if you could afford it.
Yeah, right.
So, Doctor, now you don't practice this, but do your colleagues think you're wasting your time, or look askance at your work in the folklore field in this way, or did they understand the value of it?
Yes to all the above.
Yeah. Okay. Again, that's difficult to generalize. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. A couple of weeks ago, I presented at the South Carolina Counseling Association conference, and when I usually do presentations, it's on everything from resource-directed therapy, hypnosis, all these things that I normally do. But I said this year I'm going to do something different. So I had done this research, and I gave a presentation on what I called hoodoo therapy, what I learned about psychotherapy from studying low country root doctors. And they put it at the last day, at the latest hour. And if you've ever been to continuing education, you know that, toward the end of the, people get burned out. They kind of, whatever, I'm going to hit the bar early. Well, I had a packed house. And I think, number one, it was just something so different. Number two, just mentioning these kind of different spiritual beliefs, it brings people out. Even people that, I don't really believe in any of that stuff, but you're here. Yeah. You're interested, So it went over very well, too. So there is support.
Well, you'll appreciate this because on several occasions, not for a long time now, but I have addressed groups of psychiatrists on the subject of the paranormal, because I've had many of them tell me privately that that I'm more skeptical than they are, because they tend to run into this very often in some form. And I said that, when I was working in psych wards, I would very often get the impression that particularly people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia or psychoses such as, the multiple personality thing, dissociative identity disorder, that kind of thing, were in some cases, I just got the impression that they were experiencing, real worlds that we weren't somehow, and it wasn't necessarily some sort of imbalance or chemical mix-up or whatever. And I would, in the audience, you could see the eyes turning red and steam coming out of the ears, Right. But a number of them came up to me privately at the end, or after the lecture, and said, it's funny, I've often had the same impression, but if I said that, I'd lose my job.
Right.
So there are a lot of politics and a sort of medical, political correctness and this sort of thing, at least in some cases. So perhaps you and I, in a funny way, have had similar experiences in that vein.
Yeah, it sounds like that. Although, like I say, I think part of the community is becoming more open to things. I mean, just that, like prescribing mindfulness meditation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is the new thing now, and the research shows how much mindfulness meditation, basically Buddhist meditation, can help heal the brain. Now, 20 years ago, that wouldn't even gotten started. I mean, that just wasn't a viable thing that the majority of people would incorporate into their therapy or treatment. So I think it's it's changing, but it is a lot easier when you're getting funding and things like that to have your numbers, because I can't measure therapeutic outcomes of a lot of these things that we're talking about. So that's an issue.
Do you think, or have you ever run into, or know anyone that has run into any backlash from the big pharmaceutical companies when they hear about all these new homeopathic methods?
I've had some people that I talked to in the past who, as far as backlash, nothing like they're trying to go out of their way to destroy them or anything, but tends to be, you're kind of blacklisted maybe sometimes from certain speaking engagements and that kind of thing. It's not a blacklist like you're a horrible person, but, there's just not enough research on it is the usual thing. And that may be true, to be fair. But then, research gets funded based on the whims of, a lot of times, the people who control the purse string. So if they're just not at all interested in, different types of treatment, then that a lot of times may or may not get the funding.
I feel like research for the psychological field, or at least from what I've noticed, from a little I know of it, or what I took in college at least, it's very hard to do research on psychological topics, mostly because it doesn't fit the modern scientific method. Because it's extremely, extremely hard, especially with emotional issues, that is, to repeat certain things. I mean, look at Freud. Most of his observations just make zero sense today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would disagree with that last comment about make zero sense. I would say 30%.
Okay, that works.
Well, I see the point that many people of a scientific mind would have. I mean, there is great value to disciplined thinking and peer review. And you don't have that in paranormal research, really. I mean, and perhaps knowing some of the peers, it's a good thing. But it's a matter of a lack of disciplined thinking and peer review in the sense of sharing information and having it reviewed by others. You don't often see that. Whenever I hear the term independent researcher, which is a common term among our crowd, I suppose, including ourselves, I suppose, that can be a red flag for anyone of a disciplined mind. And, I can almost understand that. But on the other hand, being closed-minded to new ideas is not in the best tradition of science, in my opinion.
That's true. I just, as someone who's an observer, I'd like to see a different scientific method, or an updated version of it.
Yes, one that is
specifically for the human sciences.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
What say you, Dr. Leslie?
Well, I'd say when we're measuring outcomes, like the client doing therapy outcomes, that's easy to measure. But in order to measure those outcomes, you have to be doing a certain theoretical orientation in your therapy.
Yes.
And the best, if not most of the times I've knocked it out of the ballpark, sometimes things just popped in my head. And it came from outer space, so to speak, or inner space, I should say, the right hemisphere of the unconscious. And it just comes out, makes no sense. Like asking, they're talking about this kind of thing, and then suddenly ask if they'd ever baked fudge brownies with a grandparent. And that led to a whole conversation that transformed the session, which transformed their lives. And how do you measure that? You can't.
Exactly.
You can't measure that.
Yeah.
So we're already limited because we're only using one theoretical orientation. And as Ben said, the X in any equation, if it's a human, it's already set up. It's not going to be consistent in a lot of ways because we're so surprising as a species.
In the human dynamic, whether it be shamanism involved or anything, or even in your work as a psychotherapist, there are other factors than just you or the shaman and the subject or the patient. There is the family, the social group, this sort of thing. What sort of have you found, I don't know, whether it be opposition or static or whatever, among people who have used shamans in your area? Do you find that there is opposition, or is there what we see, which is more acceptance of that sort of paradigm in society in general? In other words, people seem to be less skeptical about the paranormal in general than they used to be, and shamans are almost the way people talk about them in general seems to be with some respect and this sort of thing. Are you finding that, and what is the effect on the person who was the recipient of the services, so to speak?
Yeah, I would also, as answering that, and just, I'm in the Southeast, so there's always been more of a conservative element here. And, if I was in California and say, I went to my shaman today to heal me, there may be more of an acceptance.
Yeah, night and day.
Now, exactly. Now you may get the nodding, but then, turning the head with the roll. Oh boy, she went to see her shaman, know. So it's still, I don't want to say it's a taboo, but it's definitely not looked upon with the openness of other parts of the country, which I think why the conjure, hoodoo, root work tradition is so hidden down here.
Well, that's true. Well, New England as well is very. People think of us as lunatic liberals here, but that's only the politics. I mean, there is still a certain reserve and skepticism and conservatism of thought that is still very much entrenched here, I think. So people wouldn't often, whereas in California, where we have many good friends and many listeners, people routinely would talk about their last trip to their psychic. Very often here, there was a certain reticence about that. So we know what you mean. Whether the flavor is exactly the same, I don't know. But there is a certain reticence here, and perhaps it is the East Coast, and perhaps it gets a little more open in that sense as you go west. But again, we stress the caution that we might want to mention for people who would attempt to use these services. And what would you say about that? How if you knew of someone who was considering using the services of a shaman, what would your advice be? Whether caution or whatever.
Well, yeah, I caution, and it's one thing to approach with an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out.
Exactly.
So,
well put.
If it's going to be something that you're being asked to do things that are against your value system, that might not be the person for you. And that's with any type of authority figure. But I would also say if you're going to go that route, I would include, some Western treatments as well, rather than to, create a dichotomy. It's either this odd, quote-unquote stuff or this mainstream stuff. Well, I think anytime we create a dichotomy, we eliminate possibility.
Okay. Now, how much time do we have, Ben?
About 4 minutes. 4 minutes.
Okay. There's a question here I wanted to ask and get Dr. Leslie involved. Well, why don't we ask it anyway? This is from Todd, and he doesn't say where he's from, but
Todd from nowhere writes to us, I would love to see the psychological profile of some of the people you talk about. You seem like two of the saner voices in a crazy field, talking about you and I, Dad. Do you look
sure
in...
Dr. Leslie's sane, too.
Indeed.
Well, hold on now. I didn't say that.
Do you look into the psychological profiles of people that tell you their experiences? Do you find that the same personality types have paranormal things happen to them?
Well, we'll leave that for the next open line show, the last point, but I was curious about the question about the sort of psychological profile. Doctor, do you find that there is a similar type of person who consults shaman in your vicinity, at least?
A similar type of person who consults?
Similar personality types, or is it any kind of sort of variety?
I would open it up to where we have a big cultural difference too. I mean, you will find more African Americans entertaining the root doctor than Caucasian.
Okay.
You might have more Hispanics open to working with a root doctor than Asian.
All right.
So I think there's a cultural element there, but just being open-minded and just being willing to accept possibilities, I would say.
Okay, good. All right, well, we're just about out of time. Dr. Paul Leslie, thank you once again for a very interesting conversation, and we'll be in touch.
Oh, Paul and Ben, it's just been a pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you in the future, and keep up the great work.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Have a good one.
All right.
Okay.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Our announcements. Our public speaking schedule for 2015 is shaping up. The first event will be in Hampton Beach, New Hampshire on Saturday, April 18th. That's the Northeast Parafest, taking place at the Ashworth by the Sea Hotel. We're scheduled to speak from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. Other speakers include the great Lauren Coleman, the world's leading cryptozoologist. And for more info, we have links on our own site, behindtheparanormal.com, and check it out.
All right, so on October 10th, October 10th. Oh, yes, we are indeed scheduled to speak once again at the New England UFO Conference at City Hall in Leominster, Massachusetts. Other speakers will include Stan Friedman, Richard Dolan, and other great UFO guests. Watch more information on our website and also other events and all that good stuff. Don't forget about all the other stuff on our website, podcasts and all of that from both ON 1240 and our 4.5-year run on CBS Radio, along with special shows and podcasts.
Okay, and please remember the charities we mentioned as well. And next Monday, March 30th, here on ON 1240 and ONWorldwide.com, we'll welcome Butch Witkowski, a retired homicide detective who uses police techniques to investigate paranormal cases.
That sounds very interesting.
And we leave you this evening with a thought attributed to Albert Einstein. Why does this applied science, which saves work and makes life easier, bring us a little happiness? The simple answer runs because we have not yet learned to make sensible use of it. I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno, and thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey, and we shall see you next time.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.